take, I think, because the declaration itself is meaningless, right, unless you then put a plan in place to try and achieve that, and that's the current priority, is to try and give effect to it, but that was the first step along that path.
As you say, it was an emotional meeting, reading the accounts of it, but this is an emotional issue, isn't it, James?
Well, it's a deeply emotional issue if we care about our children, or if we are children facing an anxious future. As I think we all know, unless we're in really active denial, we're facing probably the biggest existential challenge to human civilization, and we are collectively responsible for it, and we are collectively responsible for the solutions. So, as a father of 5, I take it as my sacred responsibility to be doing as much as I can, and I can only hope that there are enough like-minded people out there that populate the major corporations that right now seem to be working largely to exert pressure on national governments to not change the status quo, because we're not changing the way we do business, the way we consume, the way we eat, the way we consume energy, produce energy. We're not changing any of those things fast enough to really make a big difference in the long run. But what's really encouraging for me as a resident of New Zealand and someone who spends about half my year here, between here and California, when I was shooting in Wellington recently, I read the Dominion Post every day for about, I would say, 90 days, and it was during that period of the acceptance of the idea, the nomenclature of the climate crisis, and all of the city and regional groups that were signing on and classifying it as a climate crisis. And it was in stark contrast to the media that I was getting from back in the U.S., where the president is basically literally going about the process of extricating the U.S. from the Paris Accords, and everything in that country is going the wrong direction now, because they've just handed the reins of power to the special interest groups. So, the oil lobbies and the, big food and big pharma lobbies and everybody have just really taken over. So I call it the pantheon of demons right now. But you guys should, I know that there's a lot of contention, and it's a very difficult and fractious time, and there's a lot of dialogue around this, but at least here we're having the dialogue, and we're doing things. And what you're doing at a city level is absolutely critical. A good friend of mine happens to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California, and he was, even though he was a Republican, he was only a Republican by California standards. He was very pro-business, and he believed that the future lay in green energy and in solar and in state governments, regional governments, city governments taking an active role, and basically breaking through the momentum and the logjam that's taking place at the national levels.
There's a few things that have come out of what you've both said that I want to unpack, Aaron, especially what you said. A declaration is meaningless unless it's accompanied by some sort of action. I see that a group of scientists in America have come out with their own declaration of emergency at the same time, as you say.
11,000 scientists.
11,000 scientists at the same time as President Trump has withdrawn.
Same week.
Formally from the Paris Accord. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges in terms of getting to carbon zero in Dunedin, about that plan, or zero carbon?
Yeah, it's ambitious, and I mean, in terms of there are different levels, right? So there's things that we have direct control over. So as a local authority, we are in charge of managing our transport network, and transport is one of the biggest opportunities we have in terms of reducing our carbon footprint, and that's about making public transport more efficient and more accessible, and walking and cycling safer, and all of those sorts of things. There's other stuff around waste management and the circular economy, and how we manage those sorts of things. There's stuff that you can do around the efficiency of buildings and supporting insulation of buildings and reducing the loss of energy that way. But we don't have a lot of direct influence compared to municipal governments or state governments in other jurisdictions. So a lot of what is required for us to do is effectively advocate on behalf of our community and the ambitions of our community to central government and government agencies, and get them to match that and pull the levers that they can to get us further along that path. So, you know, we can. So the commitment that we have made is that we will do everything that we can, and for the things that are outside of our direct control, we have to push harder to make sure that that happens as well. Because you need both of those things. Because the city alone doesn't have the authority to get us to where we need to get to.
You said you started by saying it's ambitious. Jim, as a director who's kind of a synonym for ambitious, how important is ambition in framing this?
Well, I think you have to set yourself a goal and have the will to do it. And the first step for that is for us as a community and as a society to be in agreement that this is something that we believe has to happen, and then we'll find the will to make the changes that we have to make. And we're going to have to make them personally. I mean, I think that it's relatively invisible to the average person in terms of their utilization, whether the electricity that you get is created from solar or geothermal or whatever. But when you have to actually make lifestyle changes in terms of how you drive, how you do transportation, what you eat, and so on, it starts to get personal. And that's where you have to have the will and you have to have the motivation, and there has to be a consensus. So I want to bring up an unpopular subject, which is that the elephant in the room in all of this in New Zealand is a cow, or a sheep, or a chicken, but mostly cows. And it goes like this. 50% of the greenhouse forcing created here is from the animal agriculture sector. The low-hanging fruit of change that exists for other countries with the electric grid and so on doesn't exist here, because we're already mostly on hydro. So a major change in electricity generation is not going to get us to 50% reductions and 100% reductions and that sort of thing. It's not going to work. Transportation, again, is a significant part of it. It's actually above the global average. I think transportation here is about 19%, and global average is about 14.5%. But the global average for animal agriculture contributing to climate change is about 14-15%. Here it's 50%. And it's a sector that represents 4% of the GDP. So there's a huge imbalance there. And if you just look at it strictly with those two data points, there's going to be a tremendous amount of change to bring that into alignment, so that the contribution to GDP and the contribution to climate forcing have to be brought into alignment. So it's going to have to change, and I think we all know it. But the farm community is highly resistant to it, and I am of the farm community. I was raised on a farm. I'm a farmer here. Don't have cows, but we're going to have to change what we grow and how we consume and how we eat. And this is a fundamental thing. I also find it very empowering, by the way, because regardless of who your elected leaders are, and here you happen to have a good one who's on the right side of history, but at a national level, regardless of who the leaders are, you can take action as an individual. And I think one of the biggest things, and it goes back to that willpower and that ability to execute, one of the biggest things we're facing is that human civilization seems to be, I call it the missing middle. We've gone directly from denial. It's too far away in time. It's happening to other people, other places. Doesn't matter to me. We've missed the middle, the battle, where you actually take on the challenge and do something, and gone right to, we're all screwed. We're all screwed. We're all going to die. Let's just party. And we've sort of skipped the middle step. Or there's a tendency in human psychology to skip that middle step, when really the battle's just getting started now. And I like challenges. Let's fix this.
There's a lot there, and I'll come back to farming in particular, because you haven't minced your words on this, and
Nope.
you haven't been afraid to put your head above the parapet in a new country. It's not uncomplicated. People from the other side of that argument will say, and you know this, that New Zealand farmers are some of the most efficient in the world. And there is an argument, as you know, that if they are to step out of the sector, inefficiency could increase.
Well, First of all, I'd take exception to that. I've heard that argument, but methane is one of the biggest things that we have to wrangle in this country. And the irony of it is that the concentrated feedlot operations in the US and in Europe are actually more efficient for methane production than free-range grazing by a factor of 2. So even though there's a lot of good science here in the way that dairy is done and the way that beef is done, people are really sticking their heads in the sand. Now, the thing is, I want to really emphasize how sympathetic I am to farmers. I have farms in Canada. I have a farm here. The purpose of those farms is to figure out how to do it better, to do less inputs, right? So farmers are really, all they want to do is just make some money off their land so they can keep their land, keep their family farm, keep their pride, and pride of place. For a lot of Kiwi farmers, it's generational. They inherited the land, and they believe in it,
and
right?
that's a really important part of the national consciousness, isn't it?
Sure.
This idea of kaitiaki-tanga,
the history.
ultra long-term guardianship.
Well, yes, but ultra long-term guardianship requires understanding what you're doing now and its impact on future generations. And the jury is not out on this. That the rivers are being polluted. You have eutrophication caused by runoff of nitrate, phosphate fertilizers. It's an interesting fact that if you ask any farmer what their primary crop is, they'll tell you, well, maybe it's milk solids or whatever, but their crop in that case would be grass, right? They're grass farmers first to be dairy farmers. Or maybe it's cash crops, maybe it's flax, maybe it's whatever. But the point is what their real crop is, because they run about 51 to 55% of the nutrient top dressing that they put on runs out into the waterways, goes into the lakes and rivers, winds up in the ocean. What their primary crop is algae. And so we need more efficient agronomy to hold on to that nutrient, because that's where your margin is as a farmer. That's where your profitability is. If you're spending hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars a year, depending on the scale of your operation, on nitrate and phosphate top dressing, and half of it's running off, you need to be practicing organic methods to retain it and retain moisture and not have to do, like in Canterbury, they're going to be running out of water there, and they've got these big center pivot systems and all that sort of thing. So what I wanted to do personally was actually get my hands dirty in farming and understand how these things work. And by the way, some of them don't work as well as they're advertised. And a lot of these organic processes don't work as well in certain areas that they work in other areas. So you've got to let the land tell you how it wants to be farmed, But we also have to talk about what we eat and changing our consumption, which will then create market drivers on what farmers are growing.
And I'll come back to that, because that question of momentum around changing our diets is something that's very much of the moment. But I just want to go back to something you both touched on about will and about consensus. Something you said at that climate emergency declaration meeting, Aaron, you called it intergenerational theft, to keep practicing business as usual.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the best week to be talking about intergenerational arguments, but it
Okay,
is.
Boomer.
Ultimately, if we're not collectively prepared to make decisions that impact us in the short term at the disproportionate expense of those who come after us, it's hard to call it anything other than intergenerational theft. That's what it is. So at least own it. That's what we're doing. Our short-termism is, robbing those who come after us because we're not prepared to make the sacrifices that we know. We know what needs to happen. We don't need any more ideas. We just need political will. But political will is too often, effectively a product of public demand. Right? Politicians make decisions for one of two reasons. One, because they think it's the right thing to do, or two, because they think they'll lose their job if they don't.
Not in that order.
Well, right. Call me an optimist. But, and so if you can't win them on the first point, then you have to do it on the second. And that was what I was trying to say earlier. It took thousands of people on the streets, the activation of people, the mobilization of people, to make the people that I sit around the decision-making table with listen and take action to a degree that we haven't. And is it enough? No. Is it significant? Yes. And do we need more of that to push us further along the line? Yes. I mean, that's how politics works, sadly.
And is the ability of politics to find a solution, a meaningful solution to this, hampered by the very nature of the political system, by the by electoral cycles?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'd like to think, and we're having the same debate at a legislative level nationally around the Zero Carbon Act, or whatever its formal name became, because that is an attempt to set an enduring legislative framework that is more immune to political cycles, and that's difficult to establish, but I think is a noble goal, because politicians are very risk-averse people who think on very short time horizons, and we don't have that luxury anymore.
A noble goal, but already being criticised in some quarters for representing too much of a compromise.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, is that legislation significant? Absolutely. Is it sufficient? Absolutely not. And we need to celebrate both of those things, because I think it's important for people who are involved in this movement, who are pushing for something that might resemble a safer climate future. We need to celebrate the progress that we're making, but at the same time acknowledge that we need people pushing for more and to do more and to do it faster. But we need both of those, because otherwise, you do end up in that position of futility. Well, what's the point? And it's hard for a movement to sustain momentum if it can't celebrate victories along the way.
Yeah, from a storyteller point of view, how important is it to frame this in such a way that hope is kept alive?
Well, this is the big dilemma, because if you really it's because we're still on the cusp of this denial problem, and it varies. It's much more out in the open. It's much more of a public dialogue here than it is in the U.S., at least at political levels. And so in the U.S., I'd say it's important to pull the fire alarm and start screaming, because people just have their heads in the sand, and there's so much confirmation bias in the way that they take in the news that they can actually write their own narratives. So storytelling has essentially got hijacked by the AI algorithms used by big data to tell you what you want to hear in a huge way. And I don't know what it is. I guess it's the natural spirit here, or the national culture, but Kiwis just seem to be more skeptical and less likely to be duped by all that, because it actually is an open dialogue and it is being politically debated. It's not in the U.S., at all. But I think it's important to have hope. But it's also important to understand the scope of the problem, because you can't really deal with it until you understand the scope of the problem and the steps that are necessary. So it's that fine balance. But I think less than whether you're pessimistic or whether you're optimistic kind of doesn't really matter. The situation is what it is. What's important is the average person needs to have something to do. They need to be given a course of action. I think it's helplessness that is the greater, psychological force at work here. Anxiety, free-floating anxiety, which tends to be paralyzing. But you give somebody something to do. If there's a proximal emergency, let's call it a flood, you hand somebody a sandbag, say, go put that over there, you're doing good, that's all they need. That's all they need. And that's what we need. We need the things that we know we can do that are going to make a difference and are good.
But again, it is that question, isn't it, when you're dealing with a problem on this magnitude of scale between personal action, household action, consumer action, business action, the things that we can do, and the need for a multilateral approach for government action, national action, and looking at the targets for whether it's going zero carbon by 2030, whatever it is, at a council level or a national level, we are asking, are these ambitious enough? Are these going to get us where we need to go?
Some scientists would tell you no, but you've got to start somewhere. And the danger is that by doing a little bit, you get to relax and pull the covers back over your head. And then it still comes up and bites you on the butt later. because you haven't done enough. But I think doing something, I think here in New Zealand, everybody should be proud that you're actually taking action and actually having this debate openly and actually declaring a crisis. Again, in stark contrast to the US, to a certain extent the UK and some other European countries, and obviously Brazil and so on, where it's all in this vast state of chaos and denial. And they're the ones that need to take action. And I would say it's not only intergenerational theft, it's intercultural theft, because the people least responsible for climate forcing are the ones who will be hit the hardest. So if you have developing nations that are highly susceptible to drought and haven't burned, a number of gigatons of coal or whatever, China and the United States and Europe are the primary drivers. The United States is the single largest emitter historically, not presently, but historically they've emitted the most carbon into the atmosphere. It's not coincidental that they're the ones who are the most in denial, have most been hijacked by special interests, and have removed themselves from the Paris Accords, because they're the most guilty. And guilty people, they're the ones that are most likely to be in denial, because people elsewhere in the world are being displaced from their land, being displaced from their shores. Their Pacific nations are going underwater as a result now that can be traced back scientifically to actions that were taken unknowingly by the major emitters. So to admit it now is psychologically difficult, and it also might open a way to some discussion of reparations or something to that extent. And now you're getting into a lot of complex factors. So it's like, why can't they just wake up and smell the coffee? Well, it's active disinformation and actively abetted denial. It's not just a simple knee-jerk psychological response.
And listening to you say that provides a context, doesn't it, for the words of someone like Greta Thunberg, who will stand up at Davos in front of the amassed leaders of the world and say, I don't want your hope, I want you to panic. The house is on fire. I don't know what both of you think about that sort of rhetoric. I mean,
she's our Martin Luther King. He had something to say in the 60s about racial equality, and he had to be a black person to say it. She's a child. It has to be a child that says it, because she's speaking for the future. And so she was the necessary voice and the necessary catalyst at the right time. And of course, it's been taken up because it's the right thing. Nobody creates a movement. They can only catalyze it into a broader thing. And you felt the political pressure from that and responded to it.
Yeah. A couple of things, and I'm pleased that you mentioned the issue of, the populations and the communities who are least responsible for causing the problems of those who are at the pointiest end of it. I mean, I'm not a scientist or a physicist. I mean, I don't come to the environmental movement from an ecological point of view. I come from a social justice background, and it became very obvious to me a few years back that the single biggest social justice issue we face is climate change, because whether it's locally, nationally, or internationally, the people who have the least capacity to absorb what's going on are, generally speaking, the people who have had the least hand in causing the problem, and so that is what we need to address. But the other thing, and it's that tension between, and I appreciate the need for people to feel invested and to have a sense that there's something that they can do to contribute to fixing the problem. But I think there's a tension in how much we want to rely on, or a risk that we rely too heavily on action at an individual level or at a household level. And people should be encouraged and should be supported into making those decisions. But we have to acknowledge, again, from a social justice lens, that often those options are things that I can take or you can take, but they come from a place of privilege, because not everyone can afford to go and buy an electric car. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're worried about whether you have to choose between heating or eating, are we surprised that you don't have the bandwidth to worry about where that chicken was raised, or the caliber, and sustainable and ethical supply chains, whether it's clothes or food or whatever, they're inherently more expensive, because that is the true cost. of those items. And under our current socioeconomic paradigms, making the right choice, so-called, is still far too unavailable to far too many people. And so while it's important to encourage people to go down that line, I think we've got to be careful about how we tell that story and how we put out those messages, because if people through no fault of their own, the environmental movement tends towards piety, and I think we needlessly shame people, not intentionally, for making the wrong choices or doing the wrong thing far too often. I think that's counterproductive, and because if we make climate action a purity test, then I'm just a Green Party mayor who owns a petrol car, and you're just a globe-trotting filmmaker who says the solution is don't eat cheese.
We're so dismissible, But the thing that you brought up that's critical is the true cost. What's the true cost of a gallon of gasoline? What's the true cost of that cheese or that steak? Because if you really were to apply to it taxation that represented the downstream mitigation costs of climate change, the building of the seawalls, the displacing of the huge immigrant populations, the farmers' relief for droughts that are devastating and wipe them out and all of that sort of thing, if you total it up, it's much more expensive to fix than to prevent. But it's because we're not being accounted to properly. We buy the gas for a tenth of its true cost. We buy the meat for a tenth of its true cost. And so this is where government and policy and social consensus has to come in, where people, the things need to cost what they really cost to that next generation. And until we have that, until we have a carbon tax, essentially some kind of trading or carbon taxation scheme that puts everything in a true market-driven level playing field, we don't have that now. It's because the special interests that are making money off the old way to make money as opposed to the new way are still driving things.
And yet, what is the likelihood of the implementation of those sorts of levers that you're talking about, given that these may end up being political decisions, given what we've just talked about, the electoral cycles and the nature, politicians want to get re-elected. That is not a popular platform.
What's the likelihood? Based on what I've seen, 0. But based on what is possible with rapid change, when you see a movement that began within the last few months and we've seen it sweeping around the world, humans are capable of change. It's what we do best. It's why we walked upright, so that we could carry stuff and go over the hill to where it was a little warmer or a little wetter or whatever it was. We're a migrant species. We've migrated all over this planet, and we've adapted to every possible biome on the planet, from the deep Arctic to the tropics, high mountain, genetically adapted, socially adapted. It's what we do. So we can adapt to a future of our own creation. But we have to know what's happening and what's required to do that adaptation. And this goes back to my empowerment, my individual empowerment, and it goes to adaptation. My position on not eating animals is not based on ethics. It's based on the environmental impact of it. And I would submit that even if it was less healthy to not eat animals and to just eat plants, we're going to have to do it anyway. But the beauty of it is that it's not. It's the most healthy way to live, and it's the best way to keep the planet healthy. But people don't want to hear it. And you talk about piety. There's nobody more pious than a vegan. That's trying.
True story.
I call
But
them
we're not saying
born again vegans.
We're not saying vegan anymore, though, are we? We're saying
No, it's back. It's
you
back.
can't say vegan.
No. You can say vegan now. You can say vegan. For a while, you couldn't say it because it put you in a category with the kind of PETA animal lovers, and there was always a bit of piety around that. And God bless them. I agree with them, but I think that it's back. It's okay. You can say vegan now, because whole food plant-based is too many letters, and the little V on the menu in the restaurant is just so much easier. But the thing is that my favorite vegan joke. How many vegans does it take to screw in a light bulb? Doesn't matter, we're better than you. It just sums it up. So when my wife and I, changed for environmental reasons almost 8 years ago, we were born again. We just had to tell everybody the good news, and we became obnoxious.
It must have been fun at parties.
It was no fun to be our friend for about 2 years. But once you know that, you realize you have to sneak up on it from a little more circumspectly, because you're really challenging people in a place where they've grown up that way. It's what we know. It's what our culture has represented to us. But it's wrong. But people they're not very good about being wrong.
It reminds me of my favorite vegan joke. Can I tell it?
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you tell if someone's vegan? Don't worry, they'll tell you.
You see? It's exactly, yeah, don't worry.
But it wasn't that long ago that greenie was a punchline
Sure.
as well, Aaron, and you're sort of at the coalface of that evolution. Tell us about getting elected. Was it a surprise
How long have
to
you
you?
This year, you mean?
Yeah.
It was, yeah. But I think if it was ever going to happen, the best chance of it happening was this year, partly for local political reasons which aren't particularly interesting, and we had an incumbent mayor standing down and all the rest of it, but partly because I think the movement that we're seeing, the popular movement that we're seeing around climate action in particular, has meant that this is a mainstream issue. I mean, I stood as a mayoral candidate in 2016 for the sole purpose of turning up at every public meeting and every forum and talking about climate change, because I knew that nobody else would. And this year, only 3 years later, and this has really shifted probably in the last 12 months, everyone is talking about it. And so, then it becomes a conversation around who do you trust to get something done, and what are people's track records. But that has shifted hugely in terms of it's a mainstream political issue, to your point. It's not a fringe issue to talk about climate change and climate action and environmentalism. And I'm super conscious that climate change isn't the only environmental issue that we're facing. No. It is the one that, as a territorial authority, we have the most control over. We're also in an ecological crisis and a biodiversity crisis,
Sure.
and all of those things need equal attention, and they lose a lot of bandwidth to climate change as the key issue. But
That's a really important point, isn't it? That question of bandwidth. How much can we absorb, cope with, deal with? And those questions around, you just addressed this, Jim. The question of what we eat. It hits us where we live, doesn't it?
Well, Aaron was just going through the list of, biodiversity loss, and, there's an interesting thing. My wife prepared this for a book that she wrote, and it was a Venn diagram, and she took all the major ecological crises of the world, from biodiversity, deforestation, ocean dead zones, waterway pollution, and so on. You go around, and where they all overlap is at animal agriculture. Agriculture in general, but mostly animal agriculture. And it turns out to be a kind of a magic wand solution to just stop eating animals. If the whole, and it gets back to a social justice issue, if the developing world comes up to the consumption levels of New Zealand and the United States, which are very similar when it comes to animal ag, we would need somewhere on the order of 4 to 6 planet Earths to support our current population eventually. And the eventually is not that long. If we all ate like somebody in India right now, a poor person in India who eats mostly plants, mostly lentils, then we could support a population on this planet of 15 billion people. So there's a huge kind of social injustice factor. It's like, we can live this way, but you can't, and you never can. Or we have to change and meet in the middle someplace so that everyone can have a reasonable lifestyle.
But the thing that occurs to me about what you're saying is, you look at that sort of cultural, historical, emotional attachment to meat in cultures outside of New Zealand. You have emergent middle classes in Indonesia and massive economies who do have that connection to meat eating. Surely it's a question of self-determination for them too, whether they want to change.
Well, it's considered a sign of affluence in China to be able to afford meat. So that as you enter the middle class there and you're making more money, you immediately start eating more, especially pork, but every type. And so it's really taking the world directly the wrong direction. It comes down ultimately, in my mind, to a land use issue. The use of land can be anywhere from 10 to 40 times more efficient in feeding people if they eat plants versus that which eats plants. Because every time you go up a trophic level, you lose efficiency. So if you eat something that eats something that eats something, you're going up one trophic level. In the ocean, when you have tuna, you're eating right at the top of the food chain. That's up about four or five trophic levels from the primary producers, which are algae. So the closer you get to the soil and you take your food directly out of the ground, so to speak, the more efficient you become. And you can deal with all of the details of chicken versus pork versus cattle versus dairy, meat cattle, but it's ultimately an efficiency thing. How do we get the most efficiency out of the land that we utilize for agriculture and therefore stop taking more land from forests, from rainforests in Brazil and so on, to feed that addiction, essentially?
But it's worth making the point too, isn't it, that large-scale industrial farming, whether it's maize or soy or whatever the vegetable crop is, that still has an impact.
It's having a huge impact, and that's being done incorrectly as well. Industrial farming is done with, GMO plants that are carefully engineered to work with Roundup pesticides and herbicides and things like that. And so that's doing incredible harm to the earth and loss of topsoil and so on. And these are all degrading processes that have to do with the amount of agriculture that we're doing. But we could cut the total amount of agriculture by 2/3, 4/5, pick your number, by not growing plants. Most soy is not consumed by us, it's consumed by cattle. Most corn is, you see what I mean? We're not using it efficiently. So ultimately it all tracks back to a land use issue. And that relates to carbon and carbon emissions and methane and all of those things.
Well, it's a finite resource, isn't it?
It's all finite. It's an extractive industry. So you look at the mining industry and the oil industry, those are extractive industries. Farming is an extractive industry. We're taking the nutrient out of the soil, and then we have to put it back. And in that case, in this country, it means shipping potash from Canada, among other things.
You mentioned your wife's book, and one of the things I like about your wife's book is it's about changing one meal.
Yeah.
One meal a day. And that goes back to your point, I think, Aaron, about this sort of purity competition when it comes to change, because it doesn't have to be all or nothing, does it?
No, everything in moderation, including moderation. But you're right. I mean, and that's why I think, just sort of nudging people along, right, and talk about the escalation of engagement, and if you can get people in at the base level, and it sounds very Catholic, doesn't it? Change a meal a week or a meal a day or whatever. I think, as opposed to, but I certainly in the absence of that, I can see the argument for going the whole hog at an individual level, because currently that isn't happening enough. So we do need to, overcompensate for people who aren't making those changes.
Because I'm aware, I'm sort of preaching to the converted here with you two. I mean, you're both engaged. You don't need to be convinced of a need for change, but we talked earlier about people who maybe do.
Well, Susie's book, my wife Susie she wrote a book called OMD, One Meal a Day for the Planet. And it came out of her being an educator and founding her own school, and it was a green school. It's a green school. It's a very green curriculum. And she came to me one day after we had gone vegan primarily for environmental reasons and said, "What? We're teaching the kids about sustainability and individual responsibility, but they're eating burgers and pizza at lunch." She said, "We have to go plant-based. We'll teach the kids to grow their own food," which they did. They put in 170 raised beds, and the kids grow their own food and eat it. And the cafeteria at the school was recently voted the greenest restaurant in the world. It beat out all the farm to table, seed to table, high end restaurants in Chicago and New York and everything. It beat them all out because it's a solar-powered school. They grow their own food. It was all built from recycled materials, the buildings, and they eat only plants. She proved her point, but half the parents left and a whole bunch came in from other states even to be a part of it. So it all worked out. But what she found was that in educating the parents so that they felt safe and comfortable about it, she said, guys, it's just one meal a day. You can have a double cheeseburger for breakfast if you want, but when you're here, you have to walk the walk because it has to be consistent with what's being taught. And so from that, she realized that's the best way to ask people to make a change is in small steps. To something that's graspable, something that they can do, that they can act on immediately, not asking them to suddenly convert to a different religion, And it's graspable. And then once you're doing it and you're starting to realize, hey, that tastes pretty good, or hey, I like this recipe, or it just starts to become easier and easier, and then you can build from there.
And that's empowering, isn't it? As opposed to that sense of shame that can come with the idea that everything I'm doing is wrong. That's not an empowerment. Yeah,
exactly. Because that's when you shut off. That's when denial clamps down. It's like somebody else will solve this, not my problem.
I see that climate change has been put on school curricula in Italy. I think it's being taught here. I mean, I've spoken to teachers who teach it. I don't know whether it has to be taught, whether it's mandatory. How much of a difference do you think that makes?
I think it's helpful. I think what's interesting for me is, outside of local politics here, I'm involved in a network of young elected members. I say young, it means under 40 in local government, but around the country. And what was interesting for me is when we talk about, and they come from a broad range of political views and ideologies and backgrounds, but the single thing that we have in common as a network of people is impatience around the urgency for climate action. It's not an ideological thing, it's not a party political thing, it's not a partisan thing, it's an existential thing. And so, young people get it. And that's what we're seeing on the streets, is that they get it. And they can't understand why people who are supposed to be their leaders or their representatives or their authority figures haven't done anything about it. So I don't think we have to worry about, I remember being asked at a candidate forum years ago, how do we get kids more involved in the environmental movement? I don't think you need to worry about them.
Yeah.
It's their parents you need to worry about.
Yeah.
And I think that was, we saw things with Generation Zero. They ran a campaign around the Zero Carbon Act called Elbow Your Elders, which was about getting young people to ring up their grandparents and talk to them about, and asking them to make submissions on legislation, because, that's how we're going to get the kind of consensus, if you like, of public demand to get the political will to do what needs to be done. But it's absolutely important that it gets taught in schools. We're kind of lucky in that it hasn't yet, touch wood, become a culture war issue here, but we've got a general election around the corner and we'll see.
Yeah. It will. It'll be like teaching evolution in the U.S., trying to teach evolution in Kansas, Yeah. It was a big deal, and it's still done very circumspectly, and there has to be equal time for creationism in certain states in the United States, which is basically, you might as well have equal time for the Flat Earth Society while you're at it. And it's this false equivalency. You got 11,000 scientists over here that say we're in an emergency. You got 3 scientists over here, 2 of them are paid by the oil companies, and one's just a stubborn old guy, But that guy will get on the news with equal time with one of the 11,000. And then everybody thinks, well, it's still an open question. But it's a false equivalency that's propagated by the media. And I have to say, the Kyoto, the RNZ magazine, did exactly that. Here's a guy speaking for, here's a guy speaking against, climate denier. Equal time on the page. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. False equivalency. I'm gonna write the magazine, because otherwise, pretty good.
Yeah. Major media outlets here have weathered criticism earlier in the year for refusing to engage with with denial as part of that conversation. Just on that question, I'm going to open it up for questions in a second, but just on that question of collective responsibility, I listened to a political commentator last weekend at an event in Wellington, a well-known commentator, say nobody cares. Nobody cares that New Zealand passed a zero carbon bill. It's a compromise. It's a tiny country at the bottom of the world. It doesn't matter. What do you think about that?
Was it Matthew Hooton?
Yes.
No. I think some of them are more predictable than others. I think it's a cop-out answer.
Yep.
I think if you add up all of the countries that have the same roughly profile of us, you get to about 25% of the global problem, and that's significant. And so for us to opt out, so not only is it significant that we do something, we also have a moral obligation to be doing things. Particularly with our Pacific friends and neighbours are literally drowning as a result of inaction and inertia. And so I think for that reason alone, we need to be more ambitious than the framework currently is. But also to say that it makes no difference, I think, is incredibly unhelpful and untrue, because you get a quarter of the world's carbon footprint opting out because they consider themselves as being too small to matter, then we're never going to get to where we need to get to.
I think the world does pay attention to New Zealand, disproportionate to its population and its GDP. I mean, you've got from Edmund Hillary to the All Blacks to the racing boats. I think people look to New Zealand as both a forward-thinking green nation and a nation of independent and rational people. I certainly think of this as one of the least insane places on an otherwise pretty delusional planet.
Here's our new strap line.
Yeah. No, it's just kind of less delusional here. And I think that somebody that stands up, Greta Thunberg is from Sweden, 14-year-old from Sweden. She stood up and challenged the world. New Zealand can do that. We're all in this together. That's the important thing that you talk about the multilateral. What we're not great at is intergovernmental cooperation, and it's getting worse. People are building walls and slamming borders and saying, it's us over them or us versus them, at a time when we need more compassion, more empathy, fewer walls, fewer divisions, and more unity of purpose as a species. So we've got to work against that, and I think New Zealand is aptly poised to be a rational voice on a global stage.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions, and we have a roving microphone. If you want to put your hand up if you have a question.
How did you start your career?
Is that for Aaron?
I started kind of late. I mean, I was a big movie fan when I was a kid. I loved movies, and I loved drawing and art and writing stories and all that. But I did a number of jobs that had nothing to do with films in my 20s. I was a machinist, a precision tool and die, machinist. I was a bus mechanic. I was a high school janitor. And I worked as a commercial artist for a while as an illustrator. And then I became a filmmaker in my mid-20s, so I started kind of late. And I started by basically just writing and making my own films. So, it was a point where I sort of got off the just paying the rent kind of pathway and just took off one day and decided to do the thing I had dreamed about, no matter what happened.
Thank you. The one over here.
Well, Mr. Cameron, Jim Devlin,
Hi.
43-year member of Local 47 Los Angeles musician.
Okay.
And
Have you played on any of my scores?
I played on a lot. I played with Chuck Berry.
Okay, good. Hey, pretty good, man.
I just want to say it's just an honor to hear you do the things that you're doing. As an American, I also spend 6 months of the year.
Good.
I'd spend more, but I'm too old in immigration, which I fully represent. I paid into the U.S. system and all.
Right, yeah.
You just, I don't really have a question. The only question I would have is tipping point. Have we passed it, or are we going to get there yet?
Thank you.
I'm not an expert on that, but from what I read, and I try to stay up on the science journals and so on, the answer is yes and no. It's a question of how heroic we're willing to be in our measures. You know, if somebody comes into the emergency room with a life-threatening injury and they're exsanguinating, and the doctor's, you know, down the hall on his coffee break, are you past the tipping point? Yeah, guy's gonna die. But if you've got a crack team that comes in and starts to work right away, then no. So it's really a question of how we respond. So people are always talking about this tipping point, but it's a moving target. You know, if we take the threat, the existential threat, seriously, and people need to understand, it's like when, you know, they talk about human extinction, what they're really talking about is an end process of a highly chaotic downgrading of human civilization that'll take place in our children's lifetime and in their children's lifetime if we don't wrangle this. And we're seeing the seeds of it right now. You know, the Syrians, refugees flooding into Europe that destabilized the entrenched governments there and caused this populist backlash in the election of people in Italy and various other European nations, and Brexit and all that can all be traced back to this influx of people coming out of Syria a few years ago from the Syrian civil war. What caused the Syrian civil war? Climate change. They had an unprecedented drought that was greater than anything they'd ever had in Syrian history, and 1 million farmers wound up in the city clamoring for the government to do something about it, and the government reacted by basically, you know, tear gassing them and suppressing them and arresting them and everything else, and then there was an uprising and it all destabilized. Those were climate refugees. The Guatemalans that were marching north toward the American border to challenge the border policy that Trump made a national issue out of, they were climate refugees. Their farms were failing because of massive changes in the rainfall patterns that had wiped out farms that had been farmed for 8 to 10 generations in Guatemala. Stable farming communities had suddenly collapsed. So we're seeing it already. So just extrapolate that, not by a factor of 10, but maybe by a factor of 100, because that's what's going to happen. So it's just going to be, walls, it's going to be division, it's going to be warfare. That's how this thing plays out. It's not about things just getting a little too hot for comfort. It's not about having to sell your beach house at a loss. It's a cascade effect. It's a domino failure. And I don't think people really grasp what it's going to look like, but all they have to do is look at the things that have happened in the last few years that have transformed geopolitics. It's already happening.
And you're already seeing it here, aren't you, Aaron, with vulnerable communities in this region? Flooding.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, low-lying communities. We're an island nation where people tend to live on the coast. We are incredibly vulnerable. I mean, dealing with risk is difficult. There was an example not far from you in the Kapiti Coast where the council there put the risk to coastal properties on the limb, which people know, you know, so people who bought that house knew that there was a risk from sea level rise, and the coastal property owners banded together and lawyered up and took the district council to court and won. And so they weren't allowed to put the risk to those properties on the limb for those properties, so that people who would then, you know, and so you're kind of powerless to some degree because there's no national direction around that sort of stuff. But it does make it, from a local government point of view, it makes it difficult, that conversation between, you know, being honest, and because that's people's retirement fund.
It's an asset. It's an asset. It affects your financial picture. I mean, here I guess the Torrey Plain, which is the big agricultural area, is mostly below sea level from what I'm told, and you've got sort of levees and stop banks and things that control that. That's going to get a lot more expensive to maintain as sea level rises. So it's going to have an impact to the bottom line here. And I think that if you look around the world, the mitigation and the actions that have to be taken are going to really total up to more than the expense of solving the problem at its source. And the longer you go, the more the heroic actions are going to cost relative to what it would cost in the short term. But we're just hardwired in our minds to not deal with situations that way.
The long-term impacts. Yes.
The fast food giants bombard the media with constant advertising globally. Is there any way of redressing that effect, or approaching it from the other side and doing advertising that would oppose it in any way from the plant-based perspective?
I think there's actually a ray of hope in the food world, or at least in the food world, because the fastest growing sector, and I'm in that business somewhat, fastest growing sector is plant-based alternatives for plant-based meats based on plant proteins, plant-based milks, plant-based cheeses, and so on. And some of the fast food chains are actually embracing that and creating their own burgers, or using the Beyond Burger or the Impossible Burger or so on, and putting that together with plant cheeses. So I think that if you look at the big food, the answer is if you just look at the market forces already at work, you can see where it's going. I'm going to give you a couple of facts on that. So we dropped a movie on Netflix, which has 100 million eyeballs, called The Game Changers 3 weeks ago, right? The Game Changers makes the most compelling case for human health and performance, athletic performance, from plant-based proteins and plant foods that I think has ever been put into a documentary, and I'm proud to have had a small part in the making of that film. Since as far back as we looked in the data, the number of hits of people investigating plant-based proteins and milks and so on has gone along pretty level, 2017, 18, 19, up until now. In the last 3 weeks, it's gone up 350%, and it's directly attributable to that one piece of media. So, when I sat down with those filmmakers, I said, we need to move the needle, and I think this can do it. And that needle moved. So now what you're having in the food sector is people are really, really investing hard in plant-based alternatives. And the fast food chains actually are jumping on the bandwagon. So I think the changes are going to be market-driven by people's interest as we wake up, as we understand the problem to our health, to the environment, and so on. We will just change it. We'll just change it from the bottom up.
The interesting thing about the Game Changers was you went straight for the jugular, so to speak, with the carnivores.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah. Well, we're probably getting a little bit off topic here, but the idea was that, men are the last bastion of carnivorism, because it's so, how can you be a, big, strong male if you don't eat meat? And the answer is we have a whole film with showing big, strong male and female champions, but mostly males, to deconstruct that male myth of meat protein. It's so deeply embedded. It's really hard to wipe out the enculturated forces that have acted on our minds since we were kids, what our parents told us, what our culture tells us, what the marketing, the billions spent on marketing tell us. But it can be done.
It's amazing how gendered food is, eh? When
Yeah.
my wife routinely will be served my vegetarian dinners or my soy coffees, or it's that's just how people are wired to think.